like to open the floor up to any questions. Has anyone got anything they'd like to ask Ishmael or Alan before we... Yeah.
Yes. Yes, Alan, please. My question goes for you.
Can you just speak a bit louder so people on the back can hear as well?
Yes, okay, thank you. Yes, Alan. Yeah, during your speech, you raised a lot of controversial issues about trying to convince that Israel is not a state of theocracy or something like that. You can try to do that, but yeah. Out of all of these controversial issues that if we are going to discuss, it may last up for long hours. Yeah. I will only just, when I found this a lot of opposite opinions, I try to go to the early beginnings. And I believe that the Israeli racism, as I believe in, is originating from the Judaism itself. Just because as far as I know, you can correct me if you please, Judaism is a religion of Jews who are born from Jews families, particularly mothers only. So nobody else allowed or accepted to be Jewish, which means Jews look to themselves like the chosen people. Over 1% of less than 1% of humanity are chosen over the remaining 99, and this to me explains the Israeli acts and the behavior in Palestinian lands. And at the end, I will just ask you to explain to me if you say that it is not a religious acts, or the Israeli don't move based on their own religion. What was Israeli doing? What was Israeli doing in Sinai between 1976 and 73 until Egyptians kicked them off? What was they doing there if it is not a fact or a matter of religion? I believe they were fulfilling the promised land.
Should I answer that now?
Yes.
First of all, I should make clear, and that comes as a surprise to you, I speak as a non-Jew. I speak as someone who's been involved in the issue for 30 years, as someone who began on the political left in the student movement, working with the Union of Jewish Students in the 1980s to prevent the banning of Jewish societies. Why were people trying to ban Jewish societies? Because the United Nations had passed this resolution then, it was unrescinded at that point, and student unions had a position of no platform for racists. So some people put two and two together and got five, which was, if we're not allowed to have a platform for racists, and the United Nations have told us that Zionists are racists and the Jewish societies are Zionists, we should ban the Jewish societies. So from that point on, for 30 years or more, I've been involved in the issue. So I don't answer your question as a Jew, but I'll try and answer your question. I'd make 3 points. Firstly, you're right in terms of matrilineal line is where it goes in terms of being a Jew and so on. Secondly, you can convert. It is possible to convert. It's not a proselytizing religion in the sense of actively seeking converts and so on, but it's possible to convert. That's certainly true. But the most important point I'd make is, my understanding is that this whole notion of chosenness is very misunderstood. I think many Jews would say it actually is a special responsibility to be, as they say, a light unto the nations, rather than a specialness or a chosenness or a superiority of any kind at all. So they would say it actually commits them to certain attitudes towards charity and justice and so on, and not to supremacy in any way. In terms of what was Israel doing in the Sinai, very briefly, right, again, context is everything, history is everything. 1967 war, let's go back a little bit and ask ourselves an interesting question, which is why between 1947-8 and 1967, when Israel was not in the West Bank and was not in Gaza, how come there wasn't a Palestinian state created? Interesting, what was going on? Jordan had annexed the West Bank and had no intention whatsoever of establishing a Palestinian state, and was completely uninterested in doing so. Egypt occupied Gaza Strip and had it under essentially military rule, had no interest whatsoever in establishing a Palestinian state. did Israel, without any provocation, invade these two places in 67 to grow its empire and so on? No. Context is this. Nasser is in power in Egypt. Every day on the radio programs coming out of Egypt, you can hear the most blood-curdling anti-Semitic rhetoric about driving the Jews into the sea. That's what you can hear. What you can see, and you know is happening, is that the Arab armies are building up on the borders of Israel. And the Arab armies are building up at the same time as this rhetoric is being pumped out from Nasser that this is going to be a war to end the Israeli state. Israel took preemptive action, and in a matter of hours, 24, 48 hours, knocked out the air forces of the about to invade Arab forces. Soon after the lightning victory over the Arab armies, in a matter of days, 6 of them, Israel's immediate response was to offer land for peace. That's what it did immediately. Again, this is for in your browse, maybe not history that you know, but the peace offer was made from Israel. The response it got at the Khartoum conference was no, no, no. No negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no let up in the war with Israel. It had no partner at that point. So Israel was then left with these territories. There's a debate within Israel. Some people think Ben Gurion, first Prime Minister being one of them, that the big mistake was not to get out immediately. The Sinai was held as a defensive shield, perimeter, against military attack. The sign that it wasn't some messianic religious purpose of being in the Sinai was that when the time came, they gave it up for the deal. They got a land for peace deal, which they'd offered in 67. They finally got it, brokered by President Carter, with Egypt, when Sadat and Begin sat together, discussed, shook hands, and Egypt says, we now have a peace deal with you, and we recognize you. And Israel said, great, we're pulling out the Sinai Peninsula, you have it back. That's the model. It's the model that was followed also in Jordan in '94, and it's the model that could be followed with other Arab states in terms of their relationships with Israel in the future. But it wasn't religious in that sense.
Thank you very much. The same concept applies to the Palestinians in these days. So
yeah, if you can have Ishmael's response and then come back to any more questions.
Two things. First is, I think, to equate what is happening in Israel because of Jewish religion, I think it's going around the wrong track. The reason for this is the emergence of Zionism was an antithesis to Judaism. When Zionism emerged, the rabbis in Europe walked as far away as possible from Zionism. In fact, Rabbi Sonnenfeld of Austria, I forget which year, but around the turn of the century when Zionism was just about to take off, quote unquote, that Zionism and Herzl is from the side of pollution and the devil. End of quote. The British Jewish Board of Deputies did not accept Zionism as a way of solving the so-called the Jewish problem in Europe until 1939. Okay? So don't equate Zionism with Judaism. Yes, what has happened over time
to occupy Tahrir Square and so on, that hasn't turned out to be the case. Stronger and more better organized forces, in particular the Islamists and the militaries, have stepped in, and they're the powerful forces now. And Israel is concerned. It has to be concerned when the 70% of people in Egypt voted for either the Muslim Brotherhood or parties to more extreme than the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafist organizations. That the treaty for now is in place. Will the treaty be in place once Egypt feels once Morsi and the Brotherhood feel themselves to be more secure, the economic prospects better? Will the peace treaty come under threat at that point? There's been a lot of very hostile rhetoric coming out of Cairo. On the other hand, Morsi played a good role, I think, in bringing Pillar of Defense, bringing the Gazan operation in November to an end. He is currently placed in negotiating between the parties to come up with some agreement for that. So it's a mixed picture. Mostly it's just uncertainty, extreme uncertainty about the security environment in which peacemaking is to happen. For instance, who will you be negotiating with in Syria if there's a discussion about the Golan Heights? We don't really know who's in charge. We don't know who's going to take over in Syria. That's unclear. Also, Israel's position, Israel would feel itself that it has 60,000 Hezbollah rockets in the north aimed at it. It has rockets from Gaza, from Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the resistance committees from the south. It has a terrorist hotbed currently in Sinai. One of the fruits of the Arab Spring has been the loss of control over the Sinai by Egypt. It has to be by Egypt. Israel can't go in there. By Egypt. So what's emerging there is a kind of hotbed of not just smuggling, but also terrorist forces, including Al-Qaeda and so on. Attacks have been launched there two ways, not just against Israel, but also against Egypt. 15 Egyptian soldiers were killed by these terrorists. So there's problems in the Sinai, problems in Gaza, Hamas has its rockets, Syria is very uncertain. And you can go around, Jordan is by no means as secure as it once was, and then of course you have the looming Iranian threat of the development of a nuclear bomb, combined with the kind of rhetoric coming out of Ahmadinejad of Holocaust denial and the threatening to wipe Israel off the map. So the combination of the potency of that weapon, plus the nature of the regime, plus the character of the ideology of the regime, means that many Israelis feel that to be whether you call it existential or not, certainly the most serious and strategic threat that Israel faces. So people have different views on this. Some people say you should use the opportunity of the Arab Spring to push ahead for peace very strongly because now's the moment to do it. Other people say it's not the moment to take risks for peace. So the Arab Spring has a kind of mixed message for Israel. I think what most Israelis are doing is, in terms of the security environment, is to keeping a watching brief and hoping for some stability, and they're trying to reach out to the new Egyptian regime, and they certainly want no conflict at all with the new Egypt, and they want decent relationships with the new Egypt, and they hope to achieve them.
I'll just touch two points. Come back on one thing on Alan, and then the Arab Spring. I think is very, very important because we need to get some sort of smashing of heads and brainstorming on this because it's a momentous occasion for the region. Revolutions through nationhood states, learning from Europe, means that they take a long time to sort of iron out. If you look at France, what happened? There's a revolution, there's a post-revolution, and then it takes many years which way it will go. So we don't know the direction. But we have to assume, because the dominant population of that region are Muslims, it will have an Islamic Muslim flavor to it. That's the nature of the beast, as they say. And I think we shouldn't be alarmed, and that shouldn't be a fear. Because if you have a fear of that, then you're an anti-Muslim. Because you say, wow, these guys are Muslims, they're going to come into power. So there's that element which I just want to sort of throw in there. As to what impact it has on Israel and Palestinians, I think it will have an impact through a third dimensional factor, because these countries on themselves are great economic powers in the sense of consumers, not as in exporters and self-sufficient, but as consumers. And I think they will soon, with uprising of China, will decide whether they want to take their currency and spend it towards China, Russia, or towards America and Europe. And that shift of economic factor, I think, will have a bigger bearing than any military or ideological. Money matters. And if this region tries to divert its financial institutes and its funds towards the East, then I think the West and the Western leadership will definitely want to address that. And that will be addressed by bringing about peace and reconciliation. I hope it happens sooner for justice than anything else. But the second the point I wanted to raise is, again, that who should Israel negotiate with in Syria, because there's such a big problem going on and we don't know who's going to come in party. Well, excuse me, we had a demagogue there for the past 45 years, one leader. There was no excuse. Why didn't they just give back the Golan Heights to him? Not that I'm particularly fond of Assad, but at least there was no excuse for any Zionist or narrative to say we don't know who to negotiate with. He was there permanent. In fact, he doesn't want to even move now if he has his way. So this idea it's simply a concept. It's a catchphrase to put a narrative that we don't have negotiating partners. And I think this Syria really exposes that this ideology. And I think we will rest that and we'll leave it to Tim.
Thanks very much for your question. I think we'll just have the last 10 minutes, and if you want to say any final remarks on this issue of Israel being an apartheid state and what we talked about earlier in the discussion as well, and then we'll end it there.
2 minutes.
Okay. I'll try and cover some of the points that were raised, but it'll have to be in a very abbreviated form. The admissions committees that you talked about, the impression I think may have been given that these admissions committees are state-sponsored and they're all over Israel and they're keeping Arabs out of areas and so on. a private corporation tried to use such an admissions committee structure, it was reported to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said it was wrong and slapped them down. That's kind of end of in that regard. The citizenship and entry law, it sounds on the surface that this is terrible, and it is terrible for the individuals involved, that someone from the West Bank who marries an Israeli can't then come and live in Israel. Again, this is where you have to dig down into the facts and so on. That law was passed in 2003. It wasn't enacted for discriminatory purposes. It also applies to citizens of Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, nations that are at war with Israel. The temporary law was adopted following a wave of attacks in March 2002 that killed 135 Israelis and injured more than 700. Prior to the amendment to the law, there were 23 terrorist attacks, including a March 2002 suicide bomb in Haifa that killed 15, that resulted from the abuse of the prior arrangement. 86% of the terror injuries occurred in attacks where that law was exploited. So that law was passed, it's consistently been reviewed by the Israeli Supreme Court, temporary residence permits are granted, there are exemptions for humanitarian reasons and so on. Whatever you think of it, it isn't a law that's been brought in out of racism against Arabs. It was brought in because of the exploitation by terrorists of that situation. So that's that. I would like to talk about unrecognised villages because I was in some unrecognised villages quite recently, and I sat with the people in the unrecognised villages and talked to them. It's not a question of racism.
Sorry, Alan.
Okay, I'll just very briefly then. Let me just make this point to end on. My friend said at the beginning that it's all about 47-48. You just need to remember what happened in 47-48. The United Nations partitioned the country into two, to an Arab state and a Jewish state. The United Nations did that. The Zionist project and the Jewish state accepted the UN partition plan. The Arabs did not. 5 Arab armies invaded the Jewish state the day after the Declaration of Independence with the declared intent of strangling the Jewish infant state at birth, 3 years after the Holocaust. 3 years after the Holocaust. There was a war of survival that took place, and 1% of the Israeli population was lost in that war of independence, but they held out against 5 invading Arab armies. In the context of that conflict, in a mix of ways, Benny Morris again, I'm sure you've read him too, Benny Morris would say, in a mix of ways, in the chaos of war, in an existential fight for survival, was produced what Palestinians call the Nakba, which is the refugee problem. We could be celebrating however many years it would be since 47 of a Palestinian state had the Arabs done so differently. My case is that's been the Arab position consistently since. At each negotiation, they've had more or less the same rejectionist position. The story of this conflict is how to get back to the moment of 47-48 and have the Palestinians accept the deal. Now, you say that Annapolis is impossible to accept. My concern there is Israelis listening to that would say it is inconceivable really to get a better deal than was offered at Annapolis. The precise questions of security and how many border guards for how long need to be in which bit of the Jordan Valley and so on can all be negotiated. Electromagnetic fields can be negotiated. Flight times for F-15s coming over and therefore whether Israel has control of airspace. All this can be negotiated, but the basic fact is there an acceptance of a Jewish sovereign presence in the Middle East? Yes or no? Is there an acceptance of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East? The Israelis' view is once there is an acceptance that there's a Jewish homeland, it's here to stay, it's not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere, the Palestinians are not going anywhere either. Can we negotiate a division of the land? And it's possible, and my case is a case for optimism. It's still possible to divide the land and to create 2 states for 2 peoples, and that's the only secure basis for peace. Acceptance of the Palestinians' absolute right to self-determination and nationhood, but not at Israel's expense. Not at Israel's expense. They can have a state, but they can't have Israel's state. Israel can move itself out of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and that can be 2 states for 2 peoples. But the idea that you can rewind history and replay 47-48 and have those 5 armies do it differently next time, that's not on the table. What's on the table is 2 states for 2 peoples, and I think tonight we've heard ways in which, for all our differences, that can possibly be the framework that unites the different parties, including the international community, and that's the way I think we should go forward.
Okay, Ishmael, would you like to say?
Thank you. Thank you. First thing, I think we should start where Alan, I would like to end where Alan started, that he came here not to discuss this, but to ensure that the smear campaign, he used the word smear against the organizers, to label Israel as an apartheid state. And this would distort the lens and bring about negative connotations. Well, let me tell you something. To refer to Israel as exercising apartheid policies in certain parts of either occupation or state of Israel is not pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli. It's not pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli. It is a just objective analysis of any human being with moral and ethical values. And therefore, we move from this, that those who are concerned about bringing justice must exercise this, promote it as much as they can, so that we bring Israel to the negotiation table, which the international instruments and our governments have failed to do. And therefore it falls upon the civic society to bring that about. And we did this once before in South Africa. And we need to do that again. And I think it's our moral and ethical responsibility. I would also like to say that 2 issues are very, very important. First is one of the Holocaust. I have no place for those who deny the Holocaust. I think it's despicable. It is a crime against humanity, the worst crime ever committed by one group of people or another. But I do not even have a place for those who look for crevices under the banner of Holocaust to commit crimes against other people. Now, the important thing is the Holocaust should be framed in a geographical location, political sphere, and in an ideology that does not relate to the Palestinians. It was geographically committed in Europe by the Nazi ideology and by the Germans. It has nothing to do with Palestinians. Why should the Palestinians pay the price of the Nazis? Why should they do that? Is this justice for human beings? Yes, they've suffered. The Europeans have tortured them throughout their history. Jewish presence has always been present in the Middle East. Always. Always under Islamic rule. No problems. The problem has occurred because of Zionism, because of the call of an independent Jewish state above and beyond anybody else. And we need to be able to differentiate this and tell and remind them of their history, that they found peace when the Spanish pogroms carried out under the Caliphate of the Ottoman Empire. They went to Turkey, they went to Egypt, they went to Libya. This was all the regions controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It was also during the time of the oppressions in Britain, when they were burned in York Cathedral, that they ran towards the Muslim lands and they protected them. So this is, again, I go back to the first issue, this is not about Muslims and Jews. This is about the Zionist, colonialist, racist ideology that sees itself and hides behind the Holocaust. And we should not allow that. I need to move forward. I would like to see that I would like to end on an optimistic note. I think we will have peace. I think we'll have justice. Why? Because there are groups of people within Israeli society itself who are now emerging, who have witnessed what they have been doing, or their government and their army has been doing in the West Bank, in Gaza, and how they're treating the Palestinians within Israel, and who are rising up and giving their hands to the Palestinians, and united, they are moving forward. And I pray, and I have a dream as well, a dream in which the next Intifada is where the Palestinians and the Israelis try to overcome and suppress the present deadlock of oppression and subjugation and occupation by the Israelis, so that they can live as a free people.
Thank you so much, Alan and Ishmael, for that really interesting debate. I think all of us have really learned a lot today, and there's still more to learn. Before everybody leaves, I'd just like to say about our event tomorrow. I've got a talk by a Hayam about the right of return to Palestinian refugees. It will be in Ashford Lecture 1, which is downstairs at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, 6 p.m.
6 p.m.
He will start discussing about the historical point of view of it and going in on the illegal settlements and then on the right of return for refugees. And yeah, and really apologize about the heat in this room, the lack of seats. We did not expect this many people to come. We're really happy that this has been successful. Thank you. Just a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you.